So before we begin, I'd like to thank Useful Charts, a channel that I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, for sponsoring this video. Along with exploring world history through the use of charts, Matt, the creator of the channel, also sells many of the charts that you see on the screen. Now, one of my favorite charts is the Ancient History Family Tree, which traces the lineages of several of the most prominent royal families of antiquity. One that's specifically relevant to this episode is the chart Ancient Egypt, History and Mythology, which shows you the family tree of not just Dynasty 4, along with some other prominent Egyptian dynasties, but also shows you the 12 largest pyramids, along with other really cool facts. There are charts from all periods of history that span the entire globe. So if interested, check out the link in the video description. And now, let's get into Dynasty 4. In the year 2615 BC, as far as we know, Egypt was quite prosperous. There doesn't seem to have been any serious drought, political instability, or costly foreign wars that the country's government had to deal with. The treasury was full, and its contents were used for all sorts of projects, most notably building and construction programs, the likes of which Egypt had never seen. At the time, the king on the throne was Huni, and his dynasty, which we simply refer to as the Third Dynasty, or Dynasty 3, was the first to attempt the construction of the monumental works of architecture that would make Egypt famous for the rest of human history, specifically Great Stone Pyramids. The first pyramid-like structure was the Step Pyramid of King Djoser at Saqqara, the great necropolis near Egypt's capital of Memphis. Designed by his vizier and chief architect, Imhotep, it was technically not a true pyramid, but a series of mastaba-like structures stacked on top of each other. The kings after Djoser attempted to build similar buildings, though they seem to have not been as successful. For the most part, everything seems to have been in order when Huni passed away in 2613 BC. Everything, perhaps with the exception of his male successor. From what Egyptologists have been able to learn, Huni didn't have a male heir at the time of his death, at least not one from his main queen, and so the son of a minor wife, who was also married to one of his daughters, named Hetepheres, became the new king. His name was Snefru, also pronounced Sneferu. It's perhaps because Snefru's mother was from a different branch of the royal family that Egypt's ancient chroniclers placed him at the start of a new line of kings, Dynasty 4. Though there are more written inscriptions and texts attributed to the kings of Dynasty 4 than earlier periods of Egyptian history, most are short proclamations of statements of events and difficult to confirm with archaeology. Thus, a true picture of what life was like in Egypt at the time for the common people is hard to put together. But for the rulers, well, there was arguably no better time in Egyptian history to have been a king. As mentioned earlier, Huni's son Snefru is named in Egyptian chronicles and historical texts as the first king of Dynasty 4. Snefru seems to have adopted the love of constructing pyramids from the previous dynasty, as at least 2, and possibly 4 pyramids are said to have been commissioned or restored by him. This includes the pyramid at the site of Meidum, whose construction may have started during the reign of Huni, but was completed by Snefru. 2 others, including the so-called Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid, are at the site of Dashur, while a 4th may be the small pyramid at the site of Sela. Building such massive monuments is extremely expensive, and takes a lot from the royal treasury, as well as massive manpower. Though at one time it was believed that such great monuments were built by slaves, today, most scholars contend that the manpower for these and other pyramids came predominantly from Egyptians themselves, whom for many, it was an honor to serve their king in such a way. Along with his massive building projects, Snefru was also remembered by later generations as a great warrior. The chronicle known as the Palermo Stone, written a few centuries after Snefru's death, records campaigns both to the west along the Libyan frontier, as well as to the south, in Nubia. One of its partially broken registers tells us about the building of ships of Merewood, hacking up the land of the Nubians, bringing 7,000 captured prisoners, 200,000 cattle, bringing 40 boats filled with cedar wood. The cedar wood came not from any battle, but from the city of Byblos, on the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. Remains of cedar wood, presumably from this region of the Levant, has been found in one of Snefru's pyramids. Other testaments to Snefru's battle prowess are rock carvings in the Sinai Peninsula, depicting the king smiting some unfortunate captive on the head. It was meant to show the locals of this remote but extremely valuable region who was boss. The mines of the Sinai were important sources of copper and turquoise, two things that the growing Egyptian economy couldn't be without. Most scholars believe that Snefru sat on the throne of Egypt for 24 years. He's believed to have been buried not at Saqqara, but in the Red Pyramid at Dashur, although his body or even his sarcophagus have never been found. The next king of Egypt is possibly one of the most famous, not for any of his great personal deeds, battles fought, or skills at statecraft, but due to the great monument he commissioned, and that has lasted, very much intact, to our own day. In fact, it's the only one of the 7 great wonders of the ancient world still standing. What I'm referring to, of course, is the Great Pyramid at Giza, built for Snefru's son and successor, King Khufu. In many ways, Khufu's reign was much like that of his father. Both kings reigned for about the same period of time, conducted foreign campaigns in the Sinai and to the south in Nubia, and funded massive building projects. One difference, though, is that Snefru was remembered by later generations as being a kind ruler, whereas Khufu was portrayed in later literature as a tyrant. While there's nothing specific in the archaeological record to back that up, he may have gained such a reputation from writers such as Herodotus, who claimed that the reign of Khufu, who he called Cheops, was harsh due to the construction of the Great Pyramid. That being said, Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza is truly impressive. Currently, it stands at over 450 feet, or 137 meters, tall, and covers over 13 acres at its base. It's estimated that at least 2.3 million individual stone blocks were used in its construction. Scholars still don't know exactly how the pyramid was built. Close to the pyramid, archaeologists found the relatively well-preserved remains of a large boat that belonged to Khufu. The belief in his day was that this vessel would help to transport Khufu to the world of the afterlife. At just over 43 meters long and 5.9 meters wide, it's one of the largest and oldest ancient vessels to have ever been discovered. Though partially restored, the boat could sail along the calm waters of the Nile even today. Khufu's reign was clearly a time of great wealth and extravagance, at least for the royal court and the kingdom's elites. And we see this not just in the objects associated with his burial, but also for the members of his family, including his mother, Queen Djedefre. Even Khufu's dog, Abitu, had a relatively lavish tomb with an inscription for him to be honored before the great god Anubis. In 2566 BC, Khufu died, and he was succeeded by his son, Djedefre, who oversaw his burial. Djedefre, though, wasn't the original heir. The kingship of Egypt was supposed to have been passed down to his brother, Kawab, but he died shortly before his father's death. little is known of Djedefre's short reign of 8 years, but he seems to have intended to follow his father in building an even larger pyramid. Work on this was started at the site today known as Abu Rawash, but it was never completed, probably because Djedefre's reign was short, and well, the next king, Khafre, had to devote resources and men to building his own pyramid. In 2558 BC, Djedefre's brother, Khafre, ascended the throne. Egypt's general stability and prosperity continued during his reign, as did trade with the outside world. The country's royal art scene was also in full gear, as some of the most realistic and beautiful stone portraits, including those of Khafre himself, were created during this time. Of course, the most famous works of art and architecture from Khafre's reign are the Second Great Pyramid at Giza and the Sphinx. The height of Khafre's pyramid is slightly shorter than that of Khufu's. However, Khafre's total funerary complex, consisting of his pyramid, the so-called Valley Temple, his mortuary temple, and the impressive 495-meter causeway made of megalithic blocks running between them, is much more massive than any at Giza. No expense seems to have been spared in its construction, and massive stones weighing several tons were brought from as far away as Aswan, 965 kilometers or 600 miles to the south. The pyramid has 3 entrances, 2 of which lead to the burial chamber beneath it. Unfortunately, when Italian archaeologist Giovanni Belzoni entered the chamber in March of 1818, he found that it had already been looted centuries before. All that remained was a plain but polished granite sarcophagus that contained a few animal bones. Unlike the others at Giza, Khafre's pyramid is the only one to have preserved significant portions of its original limestone casing, found mostly at its top. The other great work of ancient Egyptian art attributed to Khafre is the Sphinx. The face on the Great Sphinx at Giza is believed to be that of Khafre, though some modern art historians note that it looks more like Khufu. Regardless of who it really depicts, at 20 meters high and 73 in length, it's the largest royal portrait in the world. Most Egyptologists believe that Khafre reigned for 26 years. He was the first Egyptian king to have adopted the title Sah-Ra, meaning son of Ra, which may have been because of the growing popularity of the god during his reign. Many scholars also believe that the priesthood devoted to Ra had become an influential voice in politics, and may have held some power over the king and his family. Khafre died in the year 2532 BC and was laid to rest in his pyramid. According to the archaeological record, Khafre's son, Menkaure, succeeded him. He's remembered in later texts as being a relatively benevolent king, and stories of his generosity survived until at least the Egyptian late period. Though it's not expressly stated in any known records, by the reign of Menkaure around 2530 BC, Egypt, at least economically, seems to have been on the decline. As mentioned before, the construction of a massive pyramid, like those of Khufu and Khafre, is a stupendous undertaking, and needs tremendous amounts of resources and manpower, not to mention years or even decades to complete. By the time of Menkaure's reign, all of these things may have been in short supply, hence why his pyramid is a fraction of the size of both Khufu's and Khafre's, though at 65 meters high and 105 by 120 meters at its base, it was by no means a small structure. There are also 3 smaller pyramids next to his that were built for his wives. Where Menkaure had his father and grandfather beat is in the number of sculptures and portraits created in his likeness. One shows him literally walking out of solid slate rock and flanked by 2 goddesses, Hathor and a local deity, both of whose faces are believed to resemble that of his main wife, Khmer Nebti, the mother of his original crown prince, Khuenre. Unfortunately, Khuenre died before Menkaure, and so Shepseskaf, the son of a different wife, succeeded him. Shepseskaf became king of Egypt around 2500 BC. His was the last, and, at only 4 years, the shortest reign of Dynasty 4. It's quite possible, though not stated in any known text, that there may have been some trouble between the royal family and the priests of Ra. Not only was Shepseskaf not buried at Giza like his immediate ancestors, but he also chose not to, or perhaps simply couldn't afford, to have a pyramid built for himself. Instead, his final resting place ended up being a large mastaba at Saqqara. It's here that things get a bit murky, and this happens to do with the identity of a woman named Khentkawes. She was obviously a very important woman, given her elaborate tomb, but scholars disagree on her relationship to Shepseskaf. Some contend that she was his mother, while others, a daughter of Menkaure and his half-sister. Another popular hypothesis is that she was one of Shepseskaf's wives, and served as queen regent for a couple of years until the next king, Userkaf, was of age. What we do know is that most recognized king lists from Egypt end the Fourth Dynasty with Shepseskaf and start the Fifth with a king named Userkaf. More on him in the next installment of Ancient Egypt, Dynasty by Dynasty. Stay tuned. As always, thanks so much for stopping by. I sincerely appreciate it. I'd also really like to thank GrandKek69, Jaap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Danielle Allen, Danny Van Eck, Wenix TV, Robert Morgan, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Hurtado Correa, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Darawala, Sher Cam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.